Travel for me is kind of, I think, a bit in my blood now, because the largest trip that I actually did, of course, was when I migrated from England in 1965. It changed my life. I'm forever grateful that I came to Australia, because my life really began then as an artist. I eventually met up with David Fairbairn, who's now my husband. And his parents actually lived in Africa, so we started to make fairly regular visits to Zimbabwe. I found that experience of going and travelling to such a totally different kind of environment just so stimulating. Suddenly I had all these ideas that I could make all these little figures out of paper mache, carrying things on their heads. So I made a whole mass of sculptures and some paintings, but mainly sculptures. A little bit later, I did ultimately travel in Spain. And although I wasn't in a studio where I could make work from that Spanish experience, when I returned, I had left a very large painting called Shrine hanging on the wall, half done, and it was a landscape painting about Australia. When I returned and I picked up my brushes to start working on that painting again, I discovered this figure kept appearing in the centre of the painting. I'd painted out and back it would come, and I realised later it had come from an El Greco painting, from my memory of it. Being in Spain had been just quite extraordinary, seeing all of those masters, El Greco, Ribera, Velázquez and people like that, and actually looking at their work again. Back in the late 70s, I did go to New York. I did have the Visual Arts Board studio in New York. I was able to make work in situ. I was there 4 months. And then that was followed up with 3 months in Paris at the Cité. I did a huge amount of work. Most lately, I've been to Thailand and I've been to Bali. And most recently to China. China was a huge, huge change from anything I'd ever known. I'd gone there first when I was showing at Janet Clayton Gallery, because Janet had arranged an exchange show with some Chinese artists, and I hadn't ever thought about going to China, and suddenly here was this prompt. During that time, I visited Redgate Gallery and discovered that they had artist residences. David and I put in an application to go to the Redgate residence. Having the opportunity to actually make art in the studio changed the whole experience for me. I mainly spent time making an artist book, which was full of images not only of things that I'd seen, but also my own portraits. The thing that was difficult was knowing that I'd only got the month, and that precluded making a lot more work. I would have loved to have done some large paintings while I was there, but one thing I did start to do was play with some self-portraits, and I started to think I could do something three-dimensionally with that. Now, one of the objects that I could imagine using, perhaps in an installation, was the good old bamboo steamer. And one thing I did go on to do very soon after arriving home was to put those self-portraits that were on foam core into a steamer. I made little vignettes of different parts of my experience of being in China and put them into these steamers. And I ended up with this huge wall piece, 3 meters diameter, which told the story really of my having been in China. It's called China Circle. There was a whole body of work. Another thing that had happened when I'd been in China the first time, because I was staying in this Chinese hotel, every day when I came back, there'd be a little card under the door, and it would have a picture of a pretty woman and a phone number. And I thought, I could make a really great series of these. And so I actually stuck them into my travel sketchbook. And when I got home, I made a series called the Under the Door Hostesses series. And then I included a self-portrait in it called Blue Sue, which is a self-portrait of myself around the same time as those girls might have been. So there were all these different ideas coming, and there was a whole body of work came out of that experience of being in China. I think I just love not only looking at the landscape, I become aware of things like the food, obviously the historical sites are wonderful. The colour is often quite extraordinary. Just the language, listening to the language. Now, I'm very interested in text. It's carried all the way through my work through the years. But as well as that is just words and listening to people speak. And when you listen to languages that you don't understand, I find that really fascinating. And in fact, one of the last installation pieces I made for a show at Campbelltown recently included not only some strange masks, but it also had a soundscape that went with it. And that was the first time I'd ever done anything like that. It was a commission by the gallery. And so I became very interested in that. It was another way of using words in the way that I'd done by stenciling or randomly writing to have this sound that could go with it. And I'm actually interested in expanding on that.
The hypnotic sound is water soothing. This reminds me of times of travels.
It's interesting when you travel and you go to places, everybody's got their camera out or their phone out and they're taking photographs. Everybody's drawn to someone who is actually painting or drawing. They are fascinated by your interpretation because it's your interpretation. And I think that's what I want to see when I get home after traveling. I want to open up my sketchbook and see my interpretation, and they become somewhere I actually can draw in, I can write in, I can later put photographs in. So they become a whole easy to access record of a trip I've done. And they're very personal, they're very much about me and particularly where I am at that time in my life. The exhibition at Maitland is called Time Traveller, and my concept when I suggested it was that it wouldn't be just about physical travel. It's also the fascination with the fact that one is aging, so you're travelling through your life. And I guess as you get older, you're able to reflect much more about what's already happened, where you've travelled, how you've travelled. I am really particularly interested in how I have reflected a lot, particularly as I've been working on putting a book together, for instance, where I have had cause to reflect because it's about my whole life. 50 years of practice has been under the microscope for the last 2 or 3 years. And it's been really, really fascinating because I suppose I hadn't really looked in quite the detail that I have had to recently and realised how much I've actually done and how much I have revisited things. When one makes something, one thinks that's it, you've done it, you put it aside and you get ready to make the new thing. What you don't imagine you're going to do in the future is revisit that same subject and do it so differently. I've not only been concerned about actual things that I could make, tangible things I could make, but also in the whole business of the imagination, how I could imagine, how I could conceive what I might be able to do or what I might do. One of the most powerful things you have is your imagination and your ability to construct in the air before you actually make this thing tangible. Once I started working with the human skeleton and having a good look at what lies under our skin, of course I started to see I started to connect with death and what death actually meant to me. And then sadly, we lost a couple of members of our local community of artists down here. And I was suddenly really confronted with death and aging, which I probably hadn't really taken a lot of notice about. But then I also started to look at death in other societies and how other artists have portrayed death and other societies actually regard moving into the afterlife. And so this exhibition is going to have some of those skeleton paintings. There's a set of them that it's going to have in there that actually relate to lightening up of death. It's not. It's seeing this. It's inviting us to look at the skeleton, but not in a heavy, depressing way. Being able to see a bit of humour in our human body under the skin is something that I suppose I've been quite interested in and managed to make a lot of paintings from. Whether I actually think about the end of my life or the longevity or how much longer I've got, I'm not sure. I must say that as one ages, one thinks more about the end of life than you did when you were, say, 20 years ago. And then if you lose people who you cared about, that makes you think more about the end of your life. But the actual business of using that as subject matter, I think when I use it as subject matter, it's almost an exorcism in a way. It's a way of coming to terms with it, but at the same time changing it so a lot of the time it's more humorous. I don't think that the paintings or the sculptures I've made using the skeleton are particularly sad. Well, as you can see, the scale of my works, generally the major works, of which there's always one on the go, is of a large scale. People often ask me why I want to work so large. There's an incredible difference in the way that you translate the body's movement when it's on a large scale. And I really like the physicality of working broadly across a large area. It's to do with energy. I have much more energy if I'm working on a large scale. As you know, if you sit down and do something, you can be much slower. When you're working on a large scale, I just feel that I'm really engaged and I have that full-on energy to put into the work. One of the other elements of travel is how one can transpose oneself. And I suppose having lived in a city for quite a number of years, after having started out close to the coast when I first came to Australia, I then eventually lived in the city and taught at art schools. And then I made the move in about 1987 down here to Wedderburn, New South Wales. I moved down here with a 4-day-old baby, which was another. I tend to do this with young children. But that was pretty amazing to come and live in a temporary dwelling initially, and then ultimately to go on and put up a very large super farm shed and split it into 2 individual studios, and then ultimately to build a stone house, and then ultimately to put up the studio that is now my studio. That transition from living in a city to living out in the bush where one has so much space and it's so beautiful. We live on the edge of a gorge, so we've got the view of the gorge. We used to climb down the gorge a lot, and there used to be, after heavy rain, there'd be a billabong full of water at the bottom. It was just a beautiful spot, and you could go down there and there'd be birds diving in and out the water and you hear the frogs and so on. Just being able to walk out and walk around in the bush is just splendid. Having looked at a lot of my paintings from the 90s, very shortly after we moved down here, they became about the landscape, which was a very obvious thing to do. I decided to revisit the landscape in probably the last 3 years. And so it's been really fantastic. I can just go outside and can walk around. I can take a little sketchbook with me and I can do a little concertina track of my track, which goes past my studio. And I can use that as a starting point for a painting, or reference some of the growth that's out there, or bring dried things into the studio, which I've done a lot over the years. And they become objects as a starting point for the paintings. The paintings ultimately leave all the things behind. It really is a starting point. The landscape for me is really very much part of who I am now, and I cannot imagine living in a city. I think it's interesting to travel and stay in a city and be able to go to all the major museums, but really I'm a bush person now. Yeah.